One of the
With Doug Brinkley of the Silent Spring Revolution, of course, a presidential historian of major note. But Doug, just the title is like tells it all.
Well, it really was a revolution. I don't use that word lightly, but it was a reform movement of great magnitude. And Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was the equivalent of Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin or Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It just woke people up to the problem that we were destroying the earth due to the arrogance of the industrial military complex, of our nuclear genie unleashed, of pesticides and other chemicals that were unregulated. And so there was a lot accomplished in what we call the long 60s, 1960 to 1973. But it was an activist movement. It was about grassroots groups fighting smog in Pasadena, or people wanting to save sea turtles on the Gulf Texas coast, or individuals determined to make sure the Hudson River in New York was as scenic as it was in the day of the great landscape painters in Washington Irving. It happened at many different locations. There were many different people. And I also write in the book about presidents, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. But I'm really most proud of some of the work on environmental justice, looking as I do in the book at what happened in places like Fort Myers, Florida, Anniston, Alabama, Houston, Texas, where anywhere there was a black community or Latino, people would put industrial and toxic debris in their neighborhoods. So you had children dying, getting sick. This is still a rampant problem, but in the 60s, people started recognizing, calling it out. Jim Crow was under assault, and once you had the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, the 64 and 65, the next big thing to accomplish was the starting to look at environmental justice issues.
And people forget that Martin Luther King was very much aware of that.
Martin Luther King was an ecologist. His studies of Reinhold Niebuhr and others had made him understand the holistic view of looking at life and the world. And his quotes that I've discovered, about when he's dealing with getting rid of leaded paint and asbestos and ponds that are in black neighborhoods that if you fell into it you would die, about vermin and it's really remarkable. But it wasn't just Martin Luther King. In 1971, the Black Caucus was created, and people like Ron Dellums out of Oakland area really kind of partnered with people like David Brower of Friends of the Earth and started really rattling that we've got to do something on the environmental justice issue. There is such a thing as environmental racism. It's apparent if you visit the Navajo lands or if you deal with the Utes. It's apparent if you're in a barrio in San Antonio or you're in a ghetto in Philadelphia. And this is one of the plagues on the land, and we haven't solved it. Vast improvement once you get EPA and clean air and water, and you can connect civil rights to environmental justice issues, but nevertheless, our country has a long ways to go on this front.
And it's interesting that almost ironical that Johnson and Nixon, even Kennedy, you don't think of them as environmental presidents, but much of what we enjoy, like the EPA, is brought out in your book.
Well, they kept, Theodore Roosevelt cast a very long shadow on connecting American greatness to the natural world. TR used to say that the Tetons were our Taj Mahal, that the Louvre of America, it's the Smoky Mountains. That kind of thinking, that if you live in the United States, be proud of your natural heritage. And in my book, it really, all three of those presidents, to one way or another, were able to get some things done, important things done. Kennedy, particularly with National Seashores, but starting to push the Wilderness Act. And you have his embracing of Rachel Carson, his hiring of Stuart Udall, the most progressive Secretary of Interior in U.S. history, who got more done than anybody else. Harold Ickes was good, but Udall was phenomenal. And Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson trying to bring beautification as it was called, to the forefront. The passing of civil rights acts alone during Johnson's administration has environmental, connections to it. Lady Bird Johnson used to just wander and stroll around the Anacostia River in D.C., picking up garbage, setting up a notice. Here's the First Lady worried about doing river cleanup. It was the beginning of education of somebody like Lyndon Johnson, who started his career building dams. Meaning that's how he made his life and power of Texas. And here it is in the late 60s, under pressure. He would have gone either way, but in the end, they didn't dam the Colorado River and ruin the Grand Canyon. And grassroots activists like David Brower, the Sierra Club, prevailed. But what we need of presidents is they listen to the public. Johnson would have built the dams if the public didn't say, "Don't you dare." And in that way, Kennedy and Johnson were quite responsive. Kennedy in particular, with the nuclear test ban treaty, he was obsessed over stopping the testing of nuclear weapons and finding a way to achieve that, and the fact that he did is important. I love wild and scenic rivers, and I love going like to Oregon and seeing so many stretches of fast-flowing water that's been preserved, undammed, largely uncontaminated stretches of river, and that is a big heritage. You go to Arkansas, and something like saving of the Buffalo River from ruin. It's one of our prettiest rivers. The people who fought to save the Buffalo River were like the painter Thomas Hart Benton, William Fulbright, the senator, but even Orville Faubus, the racist, bigoted governor of Arkansas, eventually came to see that the buffalo had to be preserved and not ruined. So there was this something across the land, and Walt Disney made films that made coyotes seem like something more than a creature that needed to be poisoned with strychnine due to ranches. Many people started wondering, my gosh, are we really seeing the last of the bald eagle? Because DDT was thinning their shells, and along with osprey and other magnificent birds of prey, and they got saved. Today, where I grew up in Ohio, bald eagles are nesting along the Maumee River where I grew up right now. That would have been inconceivable in, say, 1965. So I need people, and I hope in the book, realize that presidents can do things, but it's the public demanding it. Nixon listened to the people because he had to. The clamor, the noise was so loud. People were demanding clean air, clean water. And I'm hoping that this book will allow people to realize that we need to save our rainforests, to save our coastal areas. Ocean preservation became very large in the 60s and 70s. I write about Sylvia Earle, and her efforts at marine conservation, and Roger Revelle and others warning about climate change. And it was a very fervent period. And while maybe Theodore Roosevelt and FDR deserve A's for their work on conservation, the three presidents I deal with in the end are, were A minuses, but they were in the ball game.
So what should we do now? I mean, given your encyclopedic knowledge of then.
Well, there's no easy answers, but the first thing is I had to realize there's not going to be a person. There's not one person that's going to come galloping, out of the canyon and saving the planet. It has to be a mass demonstration of millions and hundreds of millions of people demanding clean air and water. The astronauts I've interviewed, I did the official oral history of Neil Armstrong for NASA, and I've talked to most of the astronauts. They all thought they were going to the moon. When they got there, it was lifeless. And they knew that, but what shocked them was seeing lonely Earth floating in the sea of dark, inky darkness, and that's made people realize, well, we're all living on this beautiful planet that we've been given. It's spectacular. I see the Creator's hand everywhere you look, at birds and in ferns or forest, and you just stare at it, and it's an amazing place we have. But we are rapidly destroying the planet. And just as America is 6% of the population, eating up 20% or more of our natural resources, we also are the headquarters of research and development, California in particular. And so solutions are going to come from the West Coast in the United States. So it might be a time of states taking charge and forcing the hand of the federal government, because, as I mentioned in my talk at Warwick's, well, there is no 92-0 vote for Endangered Species Act now. We're dealing with a Republican Party that wants to dismantle the Endangered Species Act. And so that partisan federal divide that we're always living with has to be, we have to get around it by certain states fighting for environmental justice issues and leading the charge in that regard.
Can't get any better.